Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try and do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. So, how do you define a generation? Think about it. What do you think of when you hear the term baby boomers or millennials or Gen Z? They bring to mind a specific group of people that can share a common set of characteristics. We've heard baby boomers are competitive, selfish, and innovative. Millennials are lazy, self-entitled, and environmentally conscious. And Gen Z are anxious, unfocused, and multitaskers. Is there any truth to these descriptions that have made their way into popular thinking? And how and why should we define a generation at all? It's a provocative question that we put to Lisa Strohschein, a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta. Hello, Lisa. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I think we should start off, first of all, and just define what is a generation.
Right. Well, as a sociologist, we would say that these are people who share a common age and then who might also then share a collective identity. So not all generations, in fact, align or identify with their generation. Only some of them do.
Okay. Now, my understanding is this is a relatively new field of study. Is that right?
It is relatively new. So yeah, if you go back and you ask older people, what generation do you belong to? They'd probably give you a blank stare.
So then what prompted the interest in studying generations and ascribing certain characteristics to them?
Well, first of all, it's because society is changing a lot. And so if we think about, right, what it means to go through the life cycle, right, to get a job, to get married, all of these things are changing so rapidly that they're happening at different times. And so we want to think about and try to capture what does it mean to live through a particular slice of history so that even though we're experiencing all the stages of life, what that means and how it's experienced is going to be different depending on what slice of history you live through.
And, I've heard, so I don't know if this is true, but that roughly it's about 10 years for every generation. Is that true? Or like what generally is the time frame?
It's probably a little larger than that. So probably 15 to 19, or maybe a little bit bigger than that. But again, how we think about these boundaries between generations is that they tend to be fairly fuzzy, right? So clearer at their centers, fuzzier at their borders.
And what goes into actually defining a generation? What would be the main factors that sociologists like you think about that contribute to the common characteristics of a particular generation?
Right. It tends to be, technically speaking, that you have this collective consciousness, that you feel like you're part of a generation. And so when we say baby boomer or millennials, people identify, if you're a millennial, that's how you see yourself, right? And similarly, the baby boom population, right, sees themselves as that. And so it also means, right, then that we have to think about this in the context of place as well, because there are baby boom populations that have happened elsewhere in the world, but they, for the example of Japan, that baby boom population was only a couple of years long. So that generation was defined by a very narrow age gap and at a slightly different time. So generations, again, have that collective consciousness where you have this sense of a shared experiences. And they often then tend to happen in particular moments of time where there's a lot of social change going on or a lot of disruption.
Okay. So then regarding your research, because you examine 6 living generations that make up the population. So how did you do your research?
So I'm essentially, scouring what has been written about this, and then I turn all of that information onto my students. So I've been teaching now for a number of decades, and so I teach about generations, but I do so in a way that invites students to also um, tell me how their generational differences are revealed. And often I do this by getting them to interview someone who belongs to a generation that's different from themselves. And what I'm doing is essentially making them an explorer, right? So, how real is this idea of generations? Because we act as if they are real categories, that we can place people into bins based on the year that they are born. And that can prove to be quite a challenge, right? Because categories are necessarily messy. And
Mm.
so, when students themselves get to think about generations, they hear about it on the news all the time. And so they just have this assumption that it must be real, and so my task then is to get them to become self discoverers. And that is ask another person about their generation and find out how real that category is for them. And so that's the kind of information that I use and that I often turn then into when I do my writing.
Okay, so I want to go through the descriptions that your students, that you came up with regarding these six living generations. So let's start with the oldest generation that's alive right now, and they've been dubbed the greatest generation. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, it's this idea of sacrifice that really characterized this generation. That's why I'm so loath to get rid of them when I write about them. There's only about 15,000 left in Canada, so it's not a lot. But they really were defining. They lived through the Great Depression and, suffered all of the hardship of that. And then when they grew up, they went and fought World War II for us. And so I often give the example of George Bush Sr., who I know is American and, of course, is dead. And I'm talking about the dad, not the son. But he fought in World War II. He was taken as a prisoner of war. And then he went on to become president of the United States. It was a life dedicated to the service of his country. And so many in this generation, they're patriotic. They gave far more than has been asked of any other generation.
And what would be the sort of parameters year wise for that generation?
Yeah, so anyone who was born before 1928 is what we say. So this is those who are 95 and older. But of course, right, uh, we don't have anybody who's older. I think the oldest living Canadian right now is about 110. So,
Okay, that's pretty good though. 110. Wow, I didn't
yes,
know that. Wow.
super centenarians. Yeah.
Okay.
You
Um,
mentioned longer lifespans. That's where it goes.
yeah, absolutely. And what about so the next generation, they were called the silent generation. Why is that?
Yeah. So again, we know less about them. And I think people who belong to the silent generation would probably not refer to themselves in that way. So again, it's a label that sociologists have tended to place on this generation. They grew up, right, not having to experience the war, World War II. They were too young to experience. So sometimes we call them the luckiest generation
Hmm.
because of that. And they essentially, these were the kinds of people who were very much emulated the generation before them. They too were patriotic. They just weren't asked to make the kinds of sacrifices that happened for the greatest generation.
And then, we come to the baby boom generation and I don't know. I mean, just for me, from my perspective, it seemed that that generation really started off more of a public conversation about generations and their traits. I don't know. Am I right? It just really seemed to come into the sort of front and center of the public.
Yeah, it's not that the baby boomers themselves, right, decided that they were going to be
No.
a new generation. They just started this cultural revolution because at the moment in which they were coming of age, they were being called, just as previous generations had been, to go to war. And they decided they didn't want to have any of it. And that's because the war they were being asked to fight was one that they didn't believe in, right? So we're talking about the Vietnam War. And they just didn't believe in it and they rebelled against their parents, this very conformist kind of society that says you're going to do what your parents tell you to do, right? It was a complete rejection of traditional authority. And in the meantime, right, they created their own countercultural revolution. This is where we see hippies, the idea of free love, and they just explode the entire world of their parents.
Yeah, and when I think about descriptions that I've read about baby boomers, I mean, I mentioned a couple of them in the introduction about the fact that they've been seen as competitive, self-absorbed, self-centered, selfish, but also independent and innovative. I mean, I don't know, how true do you think this description is?
I wouldn't want to push those stereotypes too far. And yet, right, as a generation, right, they really brought in significant social change. We never looked back. We've never been as traditional. We've been far more challenging of authority. And so that is something that baby boomers have given to all of the generations that have come after it.
And then after that, we've got, yeah, now Gen X is an interesting one because sometimes they get excluded. I find, when you're running down the different generations, why is that?
Yeah, so the baby boomers took up a lot of oxygen. And part of that was the fact that there was so many of them, right? So after the post-World War II era, when there's a lot of economic wealth and people feel secure, they start to have lots and lots of babies. And so the size of the baby boomer far outweighs the size of Gen X, which is when we start to see that narrowing down of family size where women are having fewer children. And so that kind of helps to contribute to that. But it's also right that the moment of the time when the baby boomers emerged, it was such a defining moment. Not that there weren't defining moments for Gen X. Those would be things like the falling of the Berlin Wall, right? That's huge, right? In its own way, it gave people a sense of hope, right? That wow, like look at how the world is coming together. And then the tragedy of Challenger, which too, right, made
The
us
explosion
doubt.
of Challenger. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Hmm.
So those are some of the defining things for that generation, but it's not the same as, the complete rejection of traditional authority that occurred with the baby boomers.
I've also heard them described as latchkey children.
Yes. So again, we are seeing a time of change where women are entering into the labor market in greater numbers than ever before. And what that means is that children, right, are now in essence raising themselves. And so latchkey children is this reference to the idea that kids are coming home after school, letting themselves into the house. There's nobody at home. And then they're occupying their time taking care of themselves, waiting for their two working parents to come home.
Hmm. So, am I to assume then, because baby boomers encompass just so many people as a group, that it encompassed then children who form two generations, like Gen X and millennials?
Yeah, so Gen X is given birth to Gen Z. So it tends to be you skip a generation, right? So
Okay.
yeah, so and again, depending on when people give birth to their children, because
Right.
so the social changes, right, that we're now delaying entry into becoming a parent for the first time. So there's all these other things going on in the surface, right, that help to shift, right, when a new generation emerges.
Yeah. And then, so Gen X would encompass what period?
Okay, so we're talking about those who were born between 1966 and 1981. So between the ages of 42 and 57.
42 and 52. And so then when it comes to millennials, they are occupying what sort of years?
Yeah, so we think of them as the generation that comes of age right after the year 2000, which means then that they were born between 1982 and 1994, making them ages 29 to 41 today. So when we're complaining about young people today, we often think we're talking about the millennials, right? But then people say, oh, the millennials grew up 29 to 41. Okay, they're not the snowflakes. Right? They try to push that label down to the next generation. But it is the millennials who were originally, right, were derided with this term.
Yes,
Snowflakes.
they were. Yeah. And, okay. And so would they be a much larger group than Gen X?
Not really, because
No.
again,
Okay.
you've got the fertility rate is still on its downward decline, and
Hmm.
women are also delaying the age at which they first become mothers. So it's about equal size to Gen X. It's
Oh.
yeah, and again, it's because the bands are also of different width. So it's, yeah, I
Wow.
would not.
Okay. So not, see, isn't that interesting? It's just because they get more airtime, millennials. I thought that maybe Gen X was much smaller,
No,
but
no,
poor
no.
Gen X, right? They're
Pure
just
Gen
shunted
X.
aside. So,
Absolutely.
so when it comes to millennials, I mean, I think in sort of the public eye, they've gotten quite a bad rap. What do
They've
you
got
think?
Absolutely, they've gotten a bad rap. And,
Right?
you have to think about, this is the generation that up to this point in time, right, they are the most educated. So they have very high aspirations for themselves. But what happens to them? Well, so they, get to experience 9/11. But then, a few years later, as they themselves now with their, high levels of education expect to get out in the labor market and get these really great jobs, we have the Great Recession. And it just absolutely cuts short the career aspirations of many of them. So much so that this is a generation that has delayed buying a home, and they're only just now, right, becoming settled, uh, having the ability to purchase their own home.
So, what do you think then about descriptions that come out? That millennials are they're lazy, they're self-entitled. There's good points too. I mean, they're environmentally conscious. They seem to be more inclusive. But what do you make of those kinds of descriptions? Are they two sides of the same coin? Like, what's going on?
Yeah. So again, we've got this kind of generational conflict going on here because the older generations, where they came of age at a time where there was security, job security for them. And so they don't understand why millennials are complaining. They just think that, well, look at all this education that you have. How come you're not going out there and getting the job? Well, the job is not there for them. And so what this instills then is a complete lack of loyalty, right? So if the
Hmm.
company isn't willing, you send out resumes, you can't even get an answer from the company. You don't, when you finally get a job, you have a very short set of attachments to it. And you're going to look for something that's better because, again, you're much more educated and you expect that you're going to be landing a better job. And so you're always going to be on the lookout for that better job. The previous generations, they went into a job and they held it for life. They do not understand what it means to be like, what do you mean you're looking for a different job? They think you should be there for the rest of
Hmm.
your career.
The other, I mean, the example that I can give too is I hear people say, oh, I have these people, young people in there, and this would have been a while ago when they were in their 20s or even 30s working. And, they don't want to stay past 5 o'clock. They insist on taking their lunch hour, which kind of, why shouldn't they? It is their lunch hour. But, it's like, well, what's happened to this work ethic? And, if we have stuff that needs to get done, well, they should just get down and get to it. And then I hear from the other side of the story, like, well, we see our parents and that generation killing themselves working.
Yeah,
We want a better quality of life. Why shouldn't we have that? So I find that interesting, the two different perspectives.
absolutely. You've perfectly characterized the two very different work ethics. Work life balance on one side for the millennials, on the other side, work, what life, right?
Also, I wonder too, when you're looking at these differences in generations, maybe it's also helpful to look at parenting practices because I have a feeling, right, that every generation maybe has a different style of parenting. Not everyone, right? But maybe
Mm.
sort of commonalities of parenting. And that in itself will change the characteristics of the next generation.
Yeah. So the other big trend is what we see as the intensification of parenting. And that's to say that parents spend far more time than they ever did raising their children, right? That we think of children now as something we're invested in who they become. And if you look at previous generations, I can speak for myself. When I was growing up, it's right. Children are seen, but not heard, right?
Yeah.
That's not how it works now. Parents expect to negotiate with their kids about what kids want. They're invested in who their child becomes and they want their child to interact with them. And that means, so the older generations look at that and go like, oh, kids are so disrespectful. On the other
Mm.
hand, what you see is that there are much closer bonds between parents and children today, right? Because parents are emotionally invested in their children, and that means then that children respond accordingly. And so millennials, for example, when they were unable to get those jobs and were forced to move back into the basement of their parents' home, as happened during the Great Recession, their parents didn't mind it so much because, in fact, they had invested and were building these closer relationships. So
Mm.
that it's a very different way of thinking about over time how we have seen parenting practices change.
Hmm. Now, I've read a number of articles that talks about delayed maturation. That every generation, I guess, the next generation has taken longer to kind of reach adulthood, quote unquote, living longer at home, and maybe more dependent on parents, and perhaps not picking up the same kinds of responsibilities that previous generations had, marrying earlier, getting a house, having property, having children earlier, all those things. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, so education is a game changer, right? And so people are spending longer times in school as an investment in their own career opportunities, right? And so we now live in a world where you can't just have high school and expect to get a well paying job. So if you're going to be in school, it necessarily delays, right? Postpones all of the other kinds of life markers, the life choices that you're going to make. Who wants to get married when you're still going to school? Having a kid when you go to school, that's going to, again, put a serious damper on your ability to make something of yourself. And so intuitively, right, people are making the decisions to postpone these things. They take care of their education first, then they start looking for a partner. And that too is quite different from how it worked in the past. Often, right, and again, you
Hmm.
can think about this male breadwinner model where only the male's education matters. He finishes it, he starts looking for a wife, but she's still living at home with her parents, and she goes straight from the parental home into the marital home.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering how much of the way a generation is partly a reaction to the characteristics of the previous generation.
Yeah, so we do see that, right? So, for example, right, we would say millennials are team workers, very different from Gen X, right? Gen X was very much about being independent, innovative, in the same way that the baby boomers were. That's what they shared
Right.
with them. But if you look at millennials and Gen Z, right, and in particular their work habits, they expect to be working collaboratively. It's all about teamwork. And that's what we see in the workplace today, right? The workplace now is much more characterized, right, by the kinds of things that define both Gen Z and the millennials.
Let's talk about Gen Z. I guess a generation that is strongly, maybe the most connected to technology, just because they were born into it, right? Born into the internet, born into every cell phones, etc. Is that true? And what would make them? What would be the main things that would make them different from millennials?
Yeah, so millennials are digital natives too. The internet, right, is the only thing that they've ever known. What makes Gen Z different is smartphones. So smartphones
Mm,
come out in 2007, and so people who are born who are Gen Z have never lived right without a smartphone, and that's why we see them right so attached to them. It is the way that they communicate, it's the way that they do everything.
Do you think that that generation then, because of such a close tie to technology, would it be the first one where, oh, I don't even know quite, not that, well, how much is technology replacing human contact? I guess that, you know what I mean? Is it the most for that generation?
Right. So again, we would older generations look at this and they look aghast at it. It's like, oh my goodness, all they're doing is staring at their cell phones all of the time. They're not communicating with the real world. They're oblivious to what's happening. And in fact, right, Gen Z is just using the smartphone as a tool. That's the way they navigate their world. And so they are as social as any other generation. They just do it differently.
Do you think that's a good thing?
It's hard to say what's good, what's bad, right? So certainly there's been some controversy about this, in particular for researchers who are looking at generations who often say that perhaps the overuse of smartphones and cell phones has destroyed this generation, is giving them more mental health problems, is leaving
Mm.
them socially isolated, socially inept. Whether that will be true at the end of the day, this is still a generation that's coming of age. We're learning more about them all of the time. So let's wait on the judgment to see how they actually do. Don't forget, during COVID, when we were all sitting at home, for them, it was second nature to communicate through their cell phones. A lot of us, right, had to learn how to do it differently. And we were learning, in some sense, from what Gen Z was doing.
Yeah. Um, I it's funny. I remember the term generation gap. That used to be quite a popular term. And I was thinking about that and I thought, why is it I don't hear that as much? I don't think I hear generation gap as much. Do you? Like, is that still a relevant term that's used today?
It is still a term that's used, but that gap, of course, was most evidently felt with the baby boomers because they were the ones who so significantly
Yeah.
disrupted things. But now the changes that we've seen, and right, so millennials are not so different from Gen Z, right? And so now we're talking about a fairly wide age gap from those who are 13 to 41. They're sizable, right? And
Mm,
we can see it already, right? They are influencing social life. They're changing how we do things. And it's going to be really interesting to see what world we're going to inhabit as a
yeah.
result of how Gen Z thinks about things. So generational gap probably isn't the right word anymore, but certainly the change that they're going to bring to us will probably be, unsettling for those of us who are older.
Yeah. And when it was used before, it was usually in a negative way, right? It had a negative connotation. Oh, the generation gap. Like, I don't get you and you don't get me. That was kind of the context of it. And I was wondering whether the fact that, and you pointed this out too, um, that closer relationships seem to have developed, millennials with their parents and these successive generations. I think there's been a movement towards more inclusivity, right? And you even said teamwork. So I wonder if that also has an effect on this perceived generation gap. And maybe it's not quite so, do you know what I mean? So negative or so obvious, today.
Yeah, so I think we can see it in certain ways, right? So just to give an example, right? So think about automobiles and how people relate to cars. So if we look at older generations, and of course I'm at an age where I've got aging parents, and one of them drives and one of them doesn't. But that generation was so attached to driving; it was for them their independence. And they just
Mm,
completely identified, right? If you didn't have a car, you were not a person. And now fast forward and think about Gen Z. So Gen Z, right, most of them don't have licenses and it's not even something that's really important to them. For Gen X, right, getting your driver's license was
yes.
proof that you had arrived. And as soon as you were 16, you were going
Th-
out there and getting your beginners.
right.
That's not the case with Gen Z. Gen Z thinks about cars completely differently. And you have to think about, like, what does the future hold? In the future, we're going to have autonomous vehicles that drive for us. We're not going to think
Mhm.
about our independence as it's linked to autonomous vehicles because those cars are going to be driving independently, right? Under our direction, of course. But you're not going to have the same idea because just about anyone is going to be able to drive a car
Yeah.
any age.
Yeah.
So that gap is there, but it doesn't have that same kind of negative connotation that we
No,
might have had in the past.
no, yeah, that's a really good example. It's such a clear illustration of a difference in attitude between one generation and the next. Yeah. Um, yeah. So the other thing I wondered too is, what happens when you have one event, like one huge world affecting event, like a pandemic? Yeah, because I think about, there may be other events or social change that happens, but it may affect one generation maybe more than another. But then when you have something like the pandemic, which was kind of, I would guess almost every generation was affected by it. What does that mean then? As far as then how that generation evolves and the characteristics, that come out of it.
Yeah, so that's something we'll be watching really closely in the years ahead, right? So the pandemic itself had some immediate effects, right? So just like the millennials who went through the Great Recession, COVID, right, forced the closure of schools. It meant that those who were in Gen Z lost important opportunities to socialize, to make connections with other people. Completing school became much harder, right, when you were doing it in your bedroom versus actually interacting with other people. So there's a real loss there. But whether that's going to impact them in the long term and how they make the transition to adulthood, I think it's too soon to
Mm,
say. Because we may find, and again, if we look at the effects on other generations, we know, right, looking at the older generations, these were the people who they were nearing retirement. And when COVID hit, a good bunch of them said, I'm done with this. I don't want to work. I don't want to learn how to do Zoom. I just don't. And they exited out of the labor market. And so the net
hmm
result might be, and I think, I could safely predict that there's going to be this huge labor shortage. And so the long term effects on the Gen Z population is probably going to be relatively trivial because they're going to find that there are jobs out there waiting for them. And so the hardships that the millennials face, not being able to get a home, not being able to get the job that they really wanted, I don't think that that will pan out to be so true for the Gen Z.
For Gen Z, yeah, yeah. Now, this has been a controversial area of study, and it has had its detractors, including a researcher named Philip Cohn, a sociologist with the University of Maryland. Yeah, I mean, I was interested. I did read the op-ed that he wrote. I think it was the Washington Post, and he and other researchers, they wanted to abandon the use of labeling generations. So I really would like to know what do you think of his criticisms?
He has some valid criticism. So clearly, right, we can take categories too far, right? When we lump people into categories and say, well, you're Gen Z, so you must be this, right? That doesn't necessarily hold true for each and every person. So he's certainly right in that regards. Yet at the same time, it becomes a way again to capture social change, to think about what it means to live through different slices of history when people's experiences at different ages are going to be so different, so tied to the slice that they live through. And so this is an easy way, but again, right, can be susceptible to misinterpretation when A, we
Hmm.
place people into these bins, or B, when we assume that this is the only way that we can think about social change. It just is one way. It's not, of course, the only way that we can think about it. But it's important to realize, and I think intuitively we all know that growing up today, right, being a Gen Z is nothing like what it was when, for example, the greatest generation came of age.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because I find that when you describe each of the generations, um, you do stay away from any kind of subjective descriptors, that you talk more about the common experience and yeah, and what might have result in some sort of common feature among a generation. But, you don't use the word like lazy or, self-centered or, I mean, but those terms actually exist, right? And they're so pervasive in popular thinking. Like, so what do you think about that? The fact that we have these specific traits attributed to certain generations.
Right. So that strays into, astrology, right? So we want to, avoid trying to label generations with certain personality characteristics and rather think about, their collective experiences, the things that they are likely to identify with, right? That if you think about this idea of a latchkey kid, if you come from Gen Z, you won't have any idea of what is being said. But if you're talking to someone from Gen X, then they're going to say, oh, yes, this is, and give the description that I gave
Hmm.
earlier, kids who come home because their parents are both out working.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because, when a certain generation, I'll just say, for example, millennials, hear the negative term being ascribed to them, I mean, they take offense, right? They're like, well, wait a second. But yet at the same time, and you give the latchkey example, when you give a common experience to them, They go, yeah, sure, we can identify that. It's almost as if there's a kind of a bonding or a solidarity among the group, because many of them did have that experience of either latchkey or, their relationship with the internet or a cell phone or, being part of the counterculture, with the baby boomers. Do you agree that there can be this kind of paradoxical sort of relationship that can happen?
Yeah. And, I'm a sociologist. So at the end of the day, what I'm going to say is that the people that we become are not the people that we ourselves choose to become. We are shaped by all of the things that happen around us. And so the world events and the social change, the different kinds of trends that come and go, we experience them in ways then that help to shape who we become. And when we meet others who have been similarly shaped, we have this sense of affiliation with them, right? We feel this
Yeah.
bond of having gone through the same slice of history together.
So we missed, I guess, the youngest generation right now, didn't we? We
We've
didn't.
kind of been alluding to them, yes, but we
Yeah.
haven't quite specifically mentioned them.
What is the next generation that we're going to be following?
Yeah. So this is the seventh generation, right? And
Hmm.
so there are different names. Generation Alpha is one. The problem is, of course, is that a generation, right, if they have these shared experiences and their own collective sense of identity, it's kind of problematic to say, oh, you're Generation Alpha and this is what you
Mm.
are. And so I personally refrain from trying to describe who they are, but that doesn't mean that there aren't others who are, applying labels. So I'm going to avoid doing that, but say that, in the years to come, it's going to be interesting to see how different this new generation
Yeah.
is. It will obviously follow in the trends that we've been already observing, right? These more individualistic tendencies in society,
Right.
thinking about how they connect and use technology, and of course what happens in the future will be completely different. It'll probably be much more AI dominated, um,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
how that new generation, right, embraces and harnesses that for their own purposes, I think will be really interesting to follow.
And this generation, the seventh one, would be born the years after what
2011. So
2011.
yeah, so
Yeah.
they're still right young. They have no sense of a generational consciousness. They're just trying to get through, high school.
Yeah.
So
Let me ask you. So, do you think? I mean, despite the controversies over this area of research and the labeling that's used, what do you think is the future for generational study?
I think it becomes a useful mechanism, right? A way of thinking about who we are, right? And how we are changing and how we bridge and make connections across generations. And it's almost like thinking of society as an organism. It needs different kinds of people. It needs the patriotic people of the greatest generation. It needs the independent thinkers of the baby boomers. It needs, the desire for authenticity and the tech savvy Gen Z. And I think collectively you put all of those together and you have a society that's well balanced and is able to then accomplish great things.
Well, I really enjoyed this, Lisa. It was just a great snapshot of the whole population generationally. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Lisa Strohschein. She is with the Department of Sociology, a professor at the University of Alberta. And she is also one of the co-authors of the textbook, Sociology, Your Compass in a New Social World. And that textbook comes out next February. For more information on Lisa's work, you can check out our show notes. That is it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Please follow us on social. Our handle is @Cram Ideas. Thanks for listening and see you back here next time.